Hello, welcome to week 19 of our Through My Bible series here at St. John's. I had asked you, as you worked through some more chapters in 1 Samuel and also the book of Acts, also adding in a few chapters from 1 Chronicles, along with a whole lot of Psalms this week, to think this week about the close connection between your readings in 1 Samuel and the particular Psalms you read. And you probably noticed some commonalities there. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, you have Doeg the Edomite, who spies on David and then later reports to Saul. And then we have this wonderful window into David's thoughts concerning Doeg's treachery when he writes Psalm 52 with the notation at the beginning, when Doeg the Edomite informed Saul. Later in 1 Samuel chapter 21, you have David fleeing to the land of the Philistines, and he's captured in a sense and then brought before the king of the Philistines, and he writes Psalm 54 in talking about what his thoughts are at that time. In 1 Samuel chapter 25, you have David hiding in the cave, or it's actually chapter 24. He hides in the cave from King Saul, and it turns out to be the exact cave that Saul decides to come into, and you have David's thoughts reflected that evening when he writes Psalm 57. Psalm 59 is also written as he is pursued by Saul. And it's just really wonderful that we have not only the narrative of what's going on with David's life, but we have his personal thoughts and reflections on those given to us in the Psalms. And the Psalms, too, also give us such a wonderful window into David's faith. We'll talk more about that next week, too. And then in looking at your Acts readings, I asked if you would be able, in a couple of sentences, to discern and describe the Apostle Paul's methodology of going about his evangelism work. And you probably noticed that one of the first things that Paul would typically do is go to the synagogue, the local synagogue. As Paul had been trained as a Pharisee, and not just any Pharisee, he had been trained by Gamaliel, the highest regarded of all the Pharisees. He would have been welcomed then as a visiting scholar, a visiting rabbi, and he would have been asked to speak then to the people on the Sabbath. And he would, of course, use that opportunity to open up the Old Testament scriptures to them and then prove that Jesus was the Savior who had fulfilled those Old Testament scriptures. We do see a couple of instances where Paul speaks primarily to Gentiles, and when he does, he tries to find some point of commonality with them to start with, and then to build on that in sort of leading up to a presentation on Jesus, as he did in the city of Athens, when he looked around and he saw that temple to the unknown God and said, "Well, I see you're very religious. What you describe as unknown, I will now reveal to you today." And use that then as the departure point to talk about Jesus. The methodology that Paul exercised, which is basically taking what people know and then building on it, is certainly a useful methodology for us to use today as we go about spreading the message of God's good news. We shouldn't necessarily assume, especially these days in 21st century America, that everyone has a biblical grounding, that people automatically know what certain Bible stories are. And perhaps in telling those stories, the way that God has constructed them in the biblical narrative with such interesting features, we can lead up to a presentation of what God's love really means to the person that we are talking to. So as you continue on, you're going to finish up the book of 1 Samuel this week. You're going to move into 2 Samuel. You see the death of Saul. I know I'm spoiling some of this for you, but you'll then have the transition between Saul as the king and David as the king. It's not the most smoothest transition, so you'll want to pay attention to that. And then you'll also add those extra chapters from 1 Chronicles, some of which will parallel what you're reading in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, especially when it comes to Saul's death. And you'll continue on in the book of Acts. As you read the narratives in the books of Samuel, just think of David especially, because David is a unique figure in how God speaks of him in the Old Testament. God calls him a man after my own heart. Maybe you could have already answered this question this past week, especially as you read the Psalms that David wrote, but think of what the instances that you find in the end of 1 Samuel, the beginning of 2 Samuel, that bolster this statement by God. David is a man after the Lord's own heart. And then, as you continue looking at the work of the Apostle Paul and his traveling companions in spreading the gospel throughout the Roman Empire, you realize that Paul has this gift of dual citizenship. He is regarded as Jewish, but at the same time, he does have true Roman citizenship as well through his father. And that dual citizenship is something that God uses to bless the spreading of the gospel. You'll want to pay attention this week to how exactly God uses Paul's dual citizenship as a blessing to his kingdom. May God continue to bless you through your readings, and we will look forward to seeing you next week for the Week 20 video.